Welcome back to the class. We are in the 11th week, and in this week, we are going to take up a very interesting theme and a very interesting book titled The Cracked Mirror. This is a book co-written by two scholars, Professor Gopal Guru and Professor Sundar Sarukkai. And this book has a interesting history. This book is considered to be widely, extremely important, in the whole of social sciences in the last 1 or 2 decades. And this book is prominent on various counts. And they have titled it as The Cracked Mirror, an Indian debate on experience and theory. Okay. So in the previous classes, especially in the previous week when we discussed about the Dalit feminism, and we looked into two specific essays. One is by Gopal Guru, titled The Dalit Women Speak Differently, and another essay by Sharmila Rege, again an essay starting with the same title, Dalit Women Speak Differently. So each of these articles brought about issues about the questions of positionality, the questions of standpoint theory, the questions of how experience enables people to understand social reality differently, and how multiple positionalities and multiple identities are indeed have pedagogical and epistemological values, and how they ought to be understood and they ought to be promoted. And we have seen that the kind of a Sharmila Rage's take on Gopal Guru's argument that Dalit women indeed speak differently, and that epistemological that standpoint privilege must be granted to that. And Sharmila Rege has a more cautious approach because she thinks that a kind of an uncritical celebration of these identities can become quite apolitical, and it can robe off all the political or revolutionary projects from these kind of movements. So in all those debates, we came across questions about specific localities, specific identities, or the experiences of the people who are at the margins, or the people at the margins really making claims about their experience and their views being taken seriously to the people who occupy the center stage. So in social sciences as well, or in social science debates as well, you see this kind of questions about debate between the people who occupy the center stage and the people who occupy the peripheries. And here the center stage as well as the peripheries, I hope you understand I'm using it in a historical sense, because in almost every societies you have this huge social stratification and social discrimination in place, okay, which historically privilege certain groups with cultural and social different forms of capitals, while it deny that to certain other groups. So this particular book came out in that kind of a larger context. And this was indeed inspired by an essay written by Gopal Guru in 2002 in this very important Indian journal, Economic and Political Weekly, asking the question how egalitarian social sciences are in India. So basically he raises this question about egalitarianism in Indian social science field. And this was a very, very provocative essay, okay, mostly written in a kind of a polemical style. Of course, it's highly scholarly, but it was written in a more kind of a polemical, a very hard-hitting essay, okay, talking about a person. Gopal Guru is a Dalit scholar, a person of repute. He was a professor at Jawaharlal Nehru University. Now he is the editor of Economic and Political Weekly, a person who has contributed immensely to the theoretical debates about Dalit studies, about subaltern studies, and a host of other issues, especially in political theory. So his argument, what he presented was a scathing attack on the kind of inequality and inegalitarianism that exists in the field of social sciences, and especially the domination of the upper class, what he calls it as the TTB, the top twice born castes, okay, including the Brahmins and the other upper caste elite groups. So he argued that Indian social science scenario is structurally hugely unequal. Okay, and it is just a kind of a replica of the Indian society, which is heavily unequal and which is which is made unequal on the basis of caste inequalities. And this caste inequalities you will also find in the Indian social scenario, and that is a problem. So he addresses this essay to garner public attention to this whole question of unequal or lack of egalitarian principle in social sciences, and which has very specific set of consequences. So he says that this inequality or this lack of egalitarianism has created two kind of divisions. One, a group of people who are more privileged, who are more so-called meritorious, people who are more affluent, those who specialize in theory, in producing theory, in debating theory, in reflecting over theory, and another section of the subaltern, the downtrodden people, people who are coming from the more marginalized background, who only speak about the empirical reality. Okay, so this criticism, I think his major provocation for this work is the kind of informal ideas and the comments and arguments that float in the academic field, that the Dalit scholars who work on their own life or on Dalit issues are only merely describing their experience. Okay, they get emotional, they keep on describing their scenario. They are not kind of capable of theorizing it, or they are refusing to theorize it. They are not, either they are refusing to theorize it, or they are not capable of theorizing it. They keep on giving the kind of a more evident, more obvious empirical facts and then descriptions. And this has been criticized by people who of course occupy different social category as a kind of a substandard work, and which lacks a kind of a theoretical rigor. So Gopal Guru takes a very critical position on this particular characterization of Dalit work as as mundane and non-theoretical, and also he is extremely critical of the claim that only certain people are capable of doing theory. Okay, because this whole idea about doing theory is being seen as more intellectually challenging. It is more seen as intellectually fascinating work, but it is seen as the monopoly of a small group of people, and this small group of people are evidently essentially coming from the privileged sections of the society. So he writes and he highlights this whole issue, and he urges, he explains why that this is the case, why that the theory has been the fiefdom of a group of people. He provides historical reasons and context for that, and more importantly, he argues that the Dalits must very boldly come to the field of theorization, because theorization is something so important. So this is the important provocation for the book, and this publication in EPW created some responses, but not much. But later, this professor of philosophy, Professor Sundar Sarukkai, he was with the National Institute of Advanced Studies in Bangalore. So he joined the issue, and then he wrote an essay about kind of problematizing this whole kind of question, titled Experience and Theory from Habermas to Gopal Guru. So that was again, it was a conversation with Guru, partly agreeing with Guru, but also taking this debate much more than that. So and these two essays really caught the attention of a lot of sociologists, a lot of scholars, and then it became maybe one of the most discussed books in social science research in the recent years. It was widely discussed in university campus, and there were comments and there are criticisms against that. And later, both the scholars, both the authors decided to make it as a book, and Oxford University publication brought out it as a book in 2012, and it's titled The Cracked Mirror, and it became one of the very, very popular books. And this book has totally 9 chapters. The first one, egalitarianism and social science in India, Gopal Guru's essay, the essay that I mentioned. And secondly, Sundar Sarukkai's response, experience and theory from Habermas to Gopal Guru. And then another chapters, understanding experience, space and justice, experience and the ethics of theory, ethics of theorizing. Then two very interesting chapters on phenomenology of untouchability and archaeology of untouchability. So due to the paucity of time, I will be restricting myself only to the the introduction section and the first and the second chapters. Okay, these are the maybe these are very important chapters, but other chapters are also equally important. But these are more broader chapters that deal with more broader kind of themes. Whereas these two chapters, the last 7th and 8th chapters, are also very fascinating chapters, specifically on the questions of untouchability. Okay, so I would strongly urge you to read this book. It's considered to be a must read for social science students across disciplines, whether it is sociology, anthropology, history, or political science. It is a very important book. So in this class, I am going to look into the introduction, and we will go. I didn't want to prepare a PPT because a PPT may not do justice to the richness of the argument. So we'll go slow into these chapters, and I will take this particular session to summarize this introduction, and then 2 sessions for the first essay by Gopal Guru, and another 2 sessions for the essay by Sundar Sarukkai. So we totally take 5 hours or 5 sessions basically to discuss these 3 chapters. So that is a plan. Now, the idea of experience, particularly in the Indian context, is becoming respectable in academic discourse. A major impulse to this revival of interest is the category of experience is the continued frustration with Indian social theory. The emergence of the politics of identity is a grim reminder of this deficiency in the theorizing social reality. The politics of identity seems to have entered the discipline of social sciences in a visible and aggressive manner. Claims of identity are often grounded in specific experiences. So, basically, as the title suggests, it is a reflection about experience and theory in the Indian context. Okay, it's about the experience and theory in the Indian context. And if you remember the arguments by the book by Sundar Hardings and others on intersectionality, it is a kind of a more global scenario. They were talking about women's question, but here both the scholars want to anchor their work in the Indian context and mostly revolving around the Dalit issue. So he is talking about how experience as a category is becoming an important prominent category in social sciences, though it was kind of looked down upon in certain philosophical areas and until very recently. Okay, one of the reasons why experience is becoming important is because of the emergence of postmodernism and with the emergences of identity politics. So identity politics, we know that we discussed in the previous classes that that the postmodernism heralded an era where people began to look at their own positionality and then realize that their social milieu is different from that of the others, and thereby their experience could be different from that of others. And this was again buttressed by larger theoretical arguments which argued that especially the perspective of the vulnerable groups provide a kind of a more objective reality to the social to the society, because they are not a part of a larger dominating ideologies. So postmodernism in a sense brought focus to the kind of multiple identities and people who experience different positionalities, and subsequently the argument that these people who occupy different positionalities invariably experience society differently. So this whole introduction is about that. There is nothing new in this observation, but what is perhaps more topical is the attempt to validate diverse experience, and this by default involves a critique of any attempt to categorize diverse experiences into a few universal categories. So he's talking about this critique against or the tendency of this emergence of experience as an important category here. The suspicion of universal categories particularly holds for those categories that are in or catalyzed by the cognitive domain of dominant communities and cultures. So, this particularities of identities are also important because they are important reminders about the fallacies of a universalizing tendencies. Because if you just remember, the dominant culture ideology of any society is the ideology of the dominant class. It's an argument by Karl Marx. So similarly, every universal tendencies, every universal ideas will have a will invariably be the ideas and categories of the dominant group, and they also have an inherent tendency to either marginalize or subsume the kind of alternative identities that exist in the spheres of marginality. There's a need to move resolutely from politics of identity to ambitions of original idea. So he's kind of pushing to move away from identity politics, because identity politics is very limited in its objective. Okay, it kind of asserts its own distinctiveness, and then it argues that it is different from others. But Guru wants to have a much larger, much sharper political goal for this identity politics. And he argues that it could be very limiting. The debate in the present volume revolves around the contestation of certain well-entrenched beliefs about theory and its relation to experience, in particular presupposition based on variations of a Platonic theory of ideas, as if certain ideas exist in abstraction. The debate in this book revolves around the contestation of such disembodied notions of ideas, for they are accepted to imply that experience is subordinate to idea. So he talks about a very important argument, especially if you look into the debate between the analytical philosophy and the continental philosophy. The continental philosophy talks about it is not happy with the kind of assertions of analytical philosophy that there is a kind of an objective reality, and science and rationality will bring you the kind of the objective reality out there. This whole argument that experience cannot be reduced to ideas, and people have access to certain ideas, and this access is always mediated through experience, is an extremely important argument. In the contemporary terms, the subordination can also be read as one between experience and theory, where the experience is posterior to theory in the sense that the theory orders experience. So the conventional academic wisdom, according to Guru, is as if the theory explains your experience. Okay, theory explains your experience, and many times this theory is outside the experience. That's why he's using theory is posterior to the experience. In contrast, there is argument for the primacy of experience, from which theory not only follows but also cannot exist without this foundation. So the other argument is to give primacy to experience, because you experience the world, you experience the theory, you experience the realm of ideas basically through your experience. Okay? Through you understand the theory, you understand the values, you understand the ideas through your experience. Primarily, this is the largest space of debate in this book. And we believe that contemporary social theory cannot but engage with these issues creatively and comprehensively. So that is the kind of a fundamental section that or fundamental theme that Sarukkai and Gopal Guru want to explore in this book. The very idea that social theory has had a long and troubled relationship with the notion of experience. Inspired by the theoretical structures of natural sciences, which in turn was modeled on the unique structure of mathematics, social science kept aside experiences as a useful theoretical term. Okay, so he's talking about, if you look into even the history of sociology itself, sociology originally was modeled after natural sciences. I hope you know it by now well, that it is known as socius and logos. It is supposedly the scientific study of society. Scholars including Durkheim argued that it is an objective study of social reality. Even Weber argued that it is an objective study of the subjective values of the actors. So experience or the kind of a phenomenological turn comes much later in social sciences, because it was preoccupied with the question of objectivity. The reason is simple. For natural science, experience is problematic since it explicitly involves the human subject, and more importantly, is completely private. So on the other hand, natural science, to a large extent, even now, it dismisses or it neglects a kind of subjective dimension, because the person who engages in a researcher is supposedly absent, because you are supposedly dealing with an objective reality out there, and the experience as a researcher is insignificant, or it simply does not count. Any claim to universality and this duplicability, replicability is seemingly lost in the domain of experience. This is another very important point of difference between natural sciences and social sciences. Natural sciences tend to speak in the language of laws. Okay, and you can very well understand that social sciences also, especially sociology also, spoke in the language of laws. If you remember the law of three stages by Auguste Comte. Okay, he wanted to create a sociology model after that of physics. Okay, but now nobody talks about laws in anthropology or in sociology or even in economics. They talk about laws with a lot of caution and a lot of conditionalities attached to that. So it has a history, and that is what the Guru is talking about. Guru and Sarukkai are talking about. On the other hand, it is evident from the writings of some political philosophers that experience plays an important epistemological role in the production of thought. Okay, who you are and how your location, socio-political and economic location, how your anchoring provides you very unique vantage point to understand and engage with and then construct theories. Experience is prior to thinking and knowing, but it is susceptible to radical improvement by means of theory and philosophy. So this is a very important argument. Experience is prior to thinking and knowing because your experience is real. Okay, you are born into a family. Your childhood experiences are real. The experiences that you encounter in your youth are real. So many times it comes automatically. It comes initially, even prior to thinking and knowing, but it is susceptible to radical improvement by means of theory and philosophy. And here he gives the example of Ambedkar, who who foregrounded his experience to understand the dominant ideologies, to understand Manusmriti, and his understanding of Manusmriti was heavily influenced by his experience of being treated as an untouchable by upper caste people. So Manusmriti for him is not only a treatise written by a saint some time back, but for him Manusmriti is a book that contains the essential elements of insults and humiliation heaped on him. So once he reads Manusmriti in that context, then Manusmriti appears in a very different form. And this reading is entirely different from an upper caste person who reads Manusmriti, or somebody who has not undergone this particular experience. So finally, experience as the source of reflective consciousness denies a text the advantage of being authorial. Okay, authorial. So this is another the point that I just explained. So this particular experience allows a reader to read book in multiple ways. Okay, so what exactly the author intended, that once a book is written, the author has no control over that. Okay, then the book speaks differently, and it depends upon the context in which the book is read. It depends upon the person who reads the book. So this experience is something so central in denying the in denying this whole idea of the book as a complete production of its author. It is in the sense that the existing experience guides a person to make a careful selection of a text or intellectually inherit that text, which can establish a link between historical and contemporary experience. As for example, the experience of untouchability that was transmitted from one generation to another through the complex mediation of caste and patriarchy. So, given this, why this continued distrust of experience in the construct of the theoretical? Partly, it's a product of a particular intellectual history in which theory was bifurcated from experience. So, one important reason why experience was subordinated to theory was, of course, the preoccupation with objectivity, preoccupation with the scientific method, preoccupation with creating universal ideas and other things. Other thing he says is because the theory production or intellectual history, there was a bifurcation between experience and then theory making. As mentioned earlier, original natural sciences had much to do with it. Theory in the natural sciences can perhaps do without explicitly factoring in the experience of the individual. Okay, but this does not happen easily. The history of science can well be read as a systematic negation of the experiential. So, history of science, they argue now that it took a very specific turn by actively denying the experience of the author. Because if you look into the history of science, we do not get sufficient insights about how individual scientists, Okay, their lived experience, their context and ideas influenced science in a very specific manner. Okay, so that particular dimension is quite often neglected or negated. Galileo's dictum that launched modern science was fundamentally about the removal of secondary qualities in scientific description. So he is talking about the kind of the earlier tendency where certain things, certain qualities, for example, a weight or length or measurable things are seen as primary qualities, and a lot of other things, your perception, the taste, and a host of other things which are considered to be more individualistic, more idiosyncratic, were considered to be secondary. So he says that this has a much larger history going back to the very way in which science was understood and then practiced. Science also succeeded in enterprising because it focused on the description of the properties in the world. But this again is not an easy task. As philosophers have long argued, descriptions of the properties of the world are primarily and fundamentally descriptions of our experience of the world. Okay, this is a very important argument, because even when you talk about empiricism, there are arguments that your access to the reality, okay, the so-called realities, is mediated through your senses. And the whole argument about structuralism, the language turn, brings in the fundamental role of language in mediating the kind of a reality to you, to the reader. Okay, so the reality out there is mediated through your experiences, through your senses. The phenomenological tradition, both Indian, where almost all traditions are fundamentally phenomenological, and Western philosophy embrace this basic insight, and instead of artificially breaking up the subject and object, they look for ways to extract the objective from the omnipresence of the subjective. So this is not something was unaware to that, but the fundamental ways in which they looked at is they still try to create an objective from the multiplicity of these subjective experiences. The appearance of experience in social sciences as an important category of the act of theorizing is indebted to critical theories of subjectivity drawn primarily from what is usually referred to as continental philosophy. Okay, so as I told you, as opposed to analytical philosophy, this is more kind of phenomenological in character. It talks about human experience, ideas, intuition, and other things. The concomitant critique of universality allowed the possibility of seriously engaging with the issues such as local knowledge, ethnocultures, and so on. Because analytical philosophy is often criticized for being quite Eurocentric. It is being criticized for being using very harsh scientific kind of frameworks, okay, without being culturally sensitive to other cognitive ways in which people make sense of. Okay, there are, if you look into the cultural specificities of knowledge production, okay, there are multiple ways in which there are multiple epistemologies, there are multiple ontologies. Okay, so analytical philosophy is kind of rather insensitive to these arguments, whereas continental philosophy talks about that. At the same time, and perhaps partly inspired by this revolution, groups and communities began to assert primacy of their experience. Moreover, they began to resist attempts by outsiders to describe and recategorize their experience. Okay, so this again, as we mentioned yesterday, is a very controversial, debatable issue. For example, can men study and understand and explain women's issues? Okay, or can upper caste people study the experiences of Dalits and then describe it objectively? Okay, can a foreigner study Indian society well? So these are extremely contentious, philosophically very, very deeper issues. So an easy answer of yes or no will not be sufficient. So these questions, especially this book, is a very important insight into these debates. So this whole question of somebody coming and claiming, if you look into the whole history of anthropology, okay, this is exactly that. The history of the entire Western knowledge production is about that. Okay, it has been argued that the non-Western people do not have history, so we have to make history for them. Okay, the non-Western people do not know how to present themselves, how to theorize about themselves, so that we are coming to theorize that. So maybe at present that kind of crass form of Orientalism might not be there, okay, or prejudice might not be there, but their remnants still exist. But these reactive mores tend to dissipate as has happened with postmodernism, for example, primarily because the lack of attempt to theorize the idea of experience by drawing on different conceptual frameworks. So, Guru says that though the experience has come back to social science, the postmodern turn, okay, which kind of celebrates this multiplicity of identity or which celebrates the fragmentation of identity, falls short in theorizing it further. Okay, it and also it is least concerned about the kind of a political implications of that. So we discussed that in the previous class, that one of the major criticisms against postmodernism or the celebration of multiple identities or this endless story of fragmentation is that postmodernism is more or less a kind of an apolitical project. It does not have a kind of a political project inherent. In other words, even when individuals or groups' experience came to be valorized, the theories of experience are largely Eurocentric. Okay, so it not only theorizes insufficiently, but most of the postmodern theories are highly Eurocentric. The theories that spoke of the primacy of experience did not draw on the conceptual framework available in traditions such as Indian, Chinese, African, and so on. Ironically, this generated universal theories of experience that were based on the critique of universality itself. So the postmodern critique of universality, okay, because the moment you talk about alternative identities and the need to move beyond the singularity, the universal, you are talking about the questions of marginality, you are talking about the questions of non-hegemonic categories, okay, or non-dominant categories. But ironically, these non-hegemonic categories also were articulated in a very, very Eurocentric argument because they were least receptive or sensitive to the kind of non-Western ideas and epistemologies. Perhaps this paradox lies at the very heart of theorizing. This inherent paradox has serious consequences for social theories of non-Western societies who have inherited as many times without due process and due thought theories from the continental and Anglo-American traditions. The problem of understanding their experience through their framework is indeed a problem of greater urgency for these societies. So he's inviting the attention to these fundamental questions. This book is one small attempt to consider ways of thinking about experience in particular and experience constituting the complex entity called as India. Okay, obviously, it brings together 4 published articles and also 4 new chapters. Obviously, we do not in any way claim to have engaged with the multitudes of Indian experiences, but focus on a few in order to illustrate one particular mode of thinking about such experience, while predominantly dealing with and at the same time not fully dealing with the Dalit experience. We nevertheless look to the expanding the possibilities of describing other experience through attempts similar to us. So this is the kind of a conceptual core of this introduction. They are introducing the theme, they are introducing how experience has made a comeback to the social sciences, but how it still needs to be highly theorized. And then the remaining part is about the chronology of this, the development of this book, Guru writing the first essay, and Sundar Sarukkai responding to that, and then how they decided to put together, how they went to different universities and they put together this in EPW. So I'm not going into that because these are more kind of descriptions. And now let us get on with the first chapter. Yeah, so these are about how it is important for multiple disciplines, how it needs to create a dialogue between West and Indian. So it's the character of the typical introduction. Now this essay, Egalitarianism and the Social Science in India, we will take it up in the coming class. Thank you.